What does a perfect school look like? What would it look like if you had an institution where children could spend a large portion of their days growing spiritually, intellectually, socially, all guided by the light of sacred tradition? If you are a faithful Catholic, you believe that the Catholic Church has the best answers to this question. And the saints themselves who ran Catholic schools, while they all agreed that Catholicism should be the guiding light of our educational establishments, even they disagreed about what exactly these schools should look like. In this video, we will examine the ideal schools of St. John Baptiste de la Salle and St. John Bosco. We'll contrast the two of them, and we'll finish the video by looking at a more renegade theory of Catholic education that developed by Maria Montessori. You can make the opinion after you've watched about who you think answered the question the best. So, let's get started. We begin in prayer. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. O God, who chose your blessed confessors, St. John Baptiste and St. John Bosco, to give Christian education to the poor, and to confirm young people in the way of truth, and through him, you established new religious congregations in your church. Grant that through their intercession and example, we may be inspired with zeal for your glory and the salvation of souls, and be found worthy to share his reward in heaven. Through our Lord Jesus Christ, your Son, who lives and reigns with you in the unity of the Holy Spirit, God forever and ever. Amen. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Thank you so much for all of your continued support. I'm very grateful that I get to study church history with you so often, and I'm grateful for your appreciation of church history. Please do support the channel by giving a like and a comment of your thoughts down below, and please consider sharing the channel, all that good stuff. If you are so inclined to dive deeper into church history, consider joining the YouTube channel here. Click the join button and become a member of the Scholarium, a community of scholars seeking to be what the university was always supposed to be, a community of scholars pursuing truth, guided by sacred tradition. Once you join the Scholarium, you'll be able to take part in the Fundamentals of Theology program, and once you have passed that program, you can receive a certificate. And then you can contribute to the Scholarium by contributing your own videos and essays for discussion and debate. Let's begin. In this video, we continue our study of the traditional Catholic theory of education. What are the principles that undergird Catholic education in general? In part 1, we discussed, first of all, the value of Catholic education, which first and foremost is in its ability to evangelize both to Catholics and non-Catholics who are attracted to our schools. And despite the poor witnesses of, unfortunately, far too many Catholic schools, and we talked about the poll that I posted where I asked the viewers, what's your impression of Catholic schools? And about 67% said they are lukewarm factories. So about 67% of the viewers of this channel, of people that are generally taking their faith very seriously, have an extremely negative view of Catholic schools. It's important that while we have to recognize that there have been issues with Catholic schools, especially in the past, because Catholic schools were very affected by heretical movements in the church in the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s. And so there are some bad experiences of Catholic schools. It is paramount, however, that we don't give up on Catholic education. It's also important that we recognize that many, many Catholic schools are filled with teachers that are pouring out their careers to try to help save souls. Arguably, and I would argue this, there is no more effective way to develop the faith of such a wide range of young Catholics, as well as evangelize and hope to convert non-Catholics, than by immersing them in an authentically Catholic environment with sacred theology being taught daily at a rigorous and enlivening and inspiring manner for 8 hours a day throughout their most formative years. There is no better opportunity to change the lives of Catholics and prevent them from being lukewarm than taking full advantage of the institution of Catholic schools. Imagine if many Catholic parishes failed to live up to their calling. Would that mean that we should abandon the concept of parishes in general? In fact, many parishes do fail to live up to their calling, but we don't say that there's a problem with parishes in general, and we hope to make parishes a more dignified institution. We hope to do our part, whatever small or large that might be, to help parishes fulfill their mission of saving the souls of their parishioners. We should have the same attitude toward Catholic schools. While many Catholic schools have failed to live up to the potential of what Catholic education can be and should be, this is in fact all the more reason for us to deeply dive into the study of what makes Catholic schools great. We can't be a devout Catholic and not think that we have the ability to make the best schools. If you believe that Catholicism is the way of life that God has handed us as the greatest gift to humanity, then you have to believe that there should be a manner of educating children which extends out of that divine worldview. Catholicism is the most coherent way of perceiving reality because it is the way of perceiving reality that God has given us. God himself has written the laws and the principles of Catholicism. And when we talk about Catholic education, we're not just saying, oh, let's educate kids so that we can get them in the door to evangelize to them, although that is a primary purpose of Catholic education. But education is not separated from evangelization because we believe that our Lord is truth. And so we believe by becoming more and more in contact with truth, by studying truth, and by helping our children become wiser and become more aware of truths and help them to assimilate truths into their lives, we believe we are helping them live out their vocations more. We're helping them be what they're meant to be. And a good education is not just separate from your Catholic faith, but a good education makes you a better Catholic in general. Education is very entwined with our faith, and that's why you're all watching church history on YouTube, as well as other important lectures, I'm sure. So, while many Catholic schools have failed to live up to their potential, all Catholics, and I mean all Catholics, should prayerfully discern how can you contribute to the effectiveness of Catholic schools. We should discern how can we contribute to the effectiveness of our parishes. Should we volunteer? Maybe you're called to be a parish priest. Maybe you're called to be a nun who contributes to parish life. Maybe you should join the catechism program. Maybe you should volunteer your time in some other way. Well, we should also pray and discern how can we better influence and help the foreign missions. What's our role in the foreign missions? We all have some role. Maybe it's just financial, or maybe it's go join a mission for a few years. Maybe it's go live out your vocation as a missionary if you haven't discerned your state in life yet. We should all ask the same questions about Catholic schools because they are just as important to the life of the faith and the salvation of the souls of vulnerable but also formative and impressionable young people as the foreign missions are or as the parishes. Ask yourself very honestly, are you perhaps called to set out into the deep, leave everything behind, and pursue a career in Catholic education? In part one of this little tiny two-part series here, we discussed the educational theories of St. Thomas Aquinas, or his theories of learning. We discussed how his philosophy of learning is an important counterweight to modern constructivism, which I call educational Marxism, which was made popular by John Dewey. So constructivism believes that students must construct their own learning. The teacher is a facilitator of learning, but the teacher is not the teacher or the transmitter of knowledge. The teacher merely helps the students discover their own knowledge. I knew a certain teacher. I didn't know her personally, but I know a teacher who knew a principal. Anyways, the principal bragged once that when she was a teacher teaching a science class, she began an experiment on circuits with the kids. And one of the students asked her, well, what is it supposed to do? And this former science teacher, who is now then a principal, she bragged saying, I don't know. So she's bragging about the fact that she did not know the results of the experiment because she fully buys into the whole constructivist theory of learning. That as a teacher, you're not supposed to transmit knowledge. You're just supposed to guide the students to learn things entirely on their own, to discover everything for themselves. While Thomas Aquinas recognized that the student was the primary efficient cause of their own learning, he also understood that the teacher was a non-negotiable secondary efficient cause of learning, and the teacher did in fact have the role of transmitting the truth that the teacher already understood. So Aquinas believed in his theory of learning, and this is undergirding the traditional nature of Catholic schools in contrast to the progressive nature of public schools. The teacher already possesses truth in his mind and seeks to transmit that truth by guiding the student to arrive at truth internally by, and this is the teacher's role, activating their natural reason. The teacher builds up an understanding of timeless truths in the student's mind by helping them to realize how the self-evident principles which are taken for granted by all people can arrive at a higher truth. The teacher is supposed to model through thinking aloud how to use natural reason to get from point A to point B, to get from a self-evident principle to an abstract higher truth. In other words, lectures are okay. Lectures are not a bad thing. In the public school world, when I was in the university, we had to use the word mini lesson rather than lecture. Lecture was the bad word. You can't even, if I were to give a lesson for my professors where I was being observed, I went to a public university, and I said, well, I'm just going to go up and lecture for 45 minutes. I'd probably be kicked out of the school, because you're supposed to give what they call mini lessons, because it's seen as a bad thing when you're in the front of the room talking. I was always taught that when you're talking to the kids, you should never teach for more than 15 minutes. That's the limit. It's a bad thing when you're just transmitting knowledge. You have to have them discover the truth on their own. And St. Thomas Aquinas recognized that the student has to participate in their own learning. He even calls the student the primary efficient cause of their own learning, because they have to actively do the learning on their own. But teachers do, in fact, transmit knowledge. And if you as a teacher go up there and try to have your students rediscover how to create the light bulb, for example, they're not going to. They won't ever understand how the light bulb works, because if you truly didn't guide them, they would not arrive at the conclusion that took mankind thousands of years to arrive at. Not everything has to be learned through student-guided discovery. While discovery learning does have its place, and nobody's saying that it doesn't, because you do want to help students learn how to discover new things, transmitting knowledge also certainly has its place as well as helping students figure out how to develop an understanding of patterns. Teachers can help students do that. Teachers don't have to always have students discover that stuff on their own. The Catholic school's traditional style of education, in which objective truth based upon natural law and self-evident principles, as well as the principles revealed in divine revelation, is transmitted through teacher lectures as well as other methods, but teacher lectures are not considered inappropriate in Catholic education. This traditional approach to teaching and learning is at the heart of why Catholic schools consistently score better than public schools, not only in overall scores, but in student growth as well, which is the best measurement of how well a school is doing, is how much the students are growing. Catholic schools provide a traditional education in these 5 primary ways. First of all, most importantly, God's grace is invoked in each subject area. Learning is a spiritual act because it regards the inner man. It's appropriate to ask for God's grace at the beginning of every subject area, and most Catholic classrooms pray to begin each subject, or at least all Catholic teachers recognize they should. Second, the subjects or the curriculum taught, including such traditional subjects like grammar, cursive, spelling, all 3 of those are typically not taught in public schools anymore, as well as, hopefully, at the higher levels, scholastic philosophy and traditional literature. These things help students develop a well-rounded education that's not based on passing educational fads. In public schools, often at the level that I teach in elementary school, students typically spend about an hour and a half a day on reading and an hour and a half a day on math, and that's pretty much because those are the 2 standardized tests that public schools are measured off of. So other subjects, such as social studies, become something that happens for about 15 minutes every few days when you have time to do those 2 things. Teachers highly emphasize the subjects that they're being evaluated on as a school because of the standardized test phenomenon. And I don't think standardized tests have no place. I love objective measurements of learning, and while you could say a test is not perfect, I don't say get rid of tests. It's good to have objective measuring sticks. Just like you can't measure the success of a sports team except looking at their record ultimately, and you could say a team is better than their record, but ultimately that's, you should win games if you're a good team, and students should do well on tests if they've learned. So these traditional subject areas help Catholic schools succeed, and Catholic schools don't get rid of spelling when that's no longer used in public schools. Catholic schools haven't got rid of cursive. Most public schools have at this point. Catholic schools still teach a very grammar-heavy education, helping students build foundational understandings of logic in the way we speak. And public schools don't really dive as much into grammar. Most of the emphasis is on composition, which also has its place. Also, the books that Catholic school students are handed in high school are generally respected as time-honored classics rather than, frankly, depraved postmodern texts. Go look up your local public school and look up what books they read in high school. A lot of these books have very sexually explicit content, which is quite disturbing for children. The Kite Runner is a common book that's read in high school curriculums, and that book features the rape of young boys. It's just insane things that they hand these high schoolers to read. The Catcher in the Rye is also a very popular book read in public school high schools. It's a story that, once again, features sexual assault, and it's just why do kids need to read this stuff? People make a big deal about supporting banned books, but children don't need to read books about rape. It shouldn't be that controversial of a topic. Obviously, rape is very bad. Some people say it helps people process tragedies in their own lives. Or it doesn't. I don't think that if I read a book about rape, I'd be more prepared to go through that. You know, it's just, honestly, the whole trends in postmodern art are about the shock and the awe factor. And things are considered more beautiful the more jarring they are, and that you see that in modern art museums. You see that with modernist literature too. Things are just intended to jar you. One of the first works of this postmodern theater was The Rites of Spring, a Russian ballet about virgin sacrifice. It was in the early 20th century, and there was great riots, or not riots, but people were very upset about this when this came out in the early 20th century. But over time, that's kind of consumed our Western art. It's just this desire to shock and awe you, and that's not beauty. And children really should be exposed to beauty and beautiful literature rather than disturbing literature. There's no reason to disturb high schoolers and call that great literature. And Catholic schools should avoid that kind of literature, and typically do, though I can't speak for every Catholic school. The manner in which content is taught is also superior in traditional Catholic education. Typically, desks are aligned in rows, like you see here in most Catholic classrooms. This gets students to put most of their attention in a hierarchical manner on the front of the room, rather than in groups, which is kind of a constructivist or democratic style of education, where the students place their focus on one another. Lo and behold, when you have students facing one another, they talk more during lessons because they're looking at one another instead of looking at their teachers. Further, lectures are frequently used in Catholic education, and textbooks and workbooks are used as well. These aren't seen as bad things to have kids open up a workbook and do a page. The wheel wasn't broken. Textbooks and workbooks work. And of course, some students struggle still with textbooks and workbooks, and a lot of those students are still going to struggle with the more revolutionary styles of education in a lot of public schools. Students are encouraged to work silently, or required to work silently, in most Catholic classrooms, in order to activate their own thinking. And when I was in college, I wasn't really taught that having students silently work on a math worksheet was a good way of getting them to actually think about the math. I remember I was always taught that you should allow students to work with one another and discuss it, because through the discussion they'll come to understand it better. This collaborative learning was the primary way that you're supposed to have students work. So my first year teaching in a public school, that was the norm. I always had kids working together. And then I remember I discerned prayerfully I needed to move on to Catholic schools the next year, thanks be to God. And after I was a month into my first job at a Catholic school, and I was doing the same things. I was having the kids work on math together. And my vice principal at the time, she was in the room watching the kids learn, and she came up to me right after the class, and she said, they're just copying each other. I was like, oh yeah, that makes sense. So then I stopped doing that. 'Cause collaborative learning is just... I heard it from an old priest who said, we used to have a word for collaborative learning. Cheating. So it's kind of funny. The bar is the bar. Oh, sorry. The fourth value of Catholic education is moral education. In the Catholic schools, natural law and God's laws are the basis for moral instruction, rather than the very limited be nice morality of public schools. And I think being nice is great. We should be nice. But that's not all there is to being moral. And sometimes, in fact, the loving thing to do is to not be nice. The loving thing to do might be to be confrontational. So being nice is fine when you can, but it's good. It's not the end-all be-all of the moral law. Students are held to strict moral standards in Catholic schools because we're striving to follow God's laws, and when students refuse to submit to this moral environment, they are regularly asked to leave Catholic schools so that their behavior doesn't corrode the culture of the hallway. And in public schools, that's simply not the case. It's very difficult to expel a student in a modern public school. It involves a court hearing and everything. So you have these students that just continually bring down the culture of the public school, while in a Catholic school, you just simply ask those kids to leave. And that is also for the benefit of those children. You're not abandoning them. Sometimes that jarring experience of being kicked out of a school can help them get their life together and realize their behavior is unacceptable. Because frankly, a lot of students in a school setting, they can't have, frankly, rebellious and inappropriate, but it can be perhaps sexually inappropriate or at least very disrespectful behavior towards authorities. They need to repent of those behaviors or they're not going to live a moral life. Because if you develop bad moral habits as a child, it's extremely hard to get rid of them as you get older. So being expelled from a Catholic school can be a good thing for a child if that helps them to reevaluate their life moving forward. Finally, the bar is the bar in a Catholic school. Catholic schools, Catholic classrooms tend to teach towards the upper third of the students rather than the lower third of each class. This provides all students with the opportunity to learn as much as possible. In a public school, the emphasis is on leaving no child behind, and the teacher typically will subconsciously or consciously tailor their instruction towards the lower end students in a class. This will help some of these lower students perform better, though not all. Some students just are not putting in the effort to do better or have circumstances at home that limit their success. But if you tailor your instruction towards that lower third, you're lowering the bar for all students. And students that really deserve the B- will end up with an A because your goal is to get those lower third students a B. So you're lowering the bar, and this happens progressively. And that's why the bar has been lowered continuously to the point where recently there's been legislation in California which has ruled that students with a 50% grade can pass their classes because it's deemed to be discriminatory to not allow students to pass high school who aren't able to get a 60%. Which, if you have a pulse and you're turning in your work, you'll get a 60%. But apparently, it's discriminatory to discriminate against children who are unmotivated and don't want to turn in their work. This lowering of the bar in education has extended into our nation, and that's why businesses are run inefficiently today, and that's why you can't even go to a Tim Hortons and order a coffee and get the right drink handed to you, because the bar has been lowered in our schools, and the bar has been lowered throughout American society as well. While the above principles are, of course, not perfectly followed in many Catholic schools, because it's up to each individual teacher to implement these principles. And there are going to be teachers in the Catholic schools who have more of the attitude of public schools, just like there are teachers in the public schools who have more of a traditional attitude towards education. Most people who attended public schools, myself included, can recall some teachers that they had that just stood in the front of the room and lectured, and they were great. Mr. Van Gelder was a phenomenal teacher that I had, and that's what he would do. He would just stand in the front of the room and talk about economics when he wasn't showing Ron Stossel to the class to explain economics. So you're going to have some more traditional teachers in public schools. You're going to have some more progressive teachers in Catholic schools. But the general disposition of the school certainly is what it is. Your traditional lecture-style teacher will be looked down upon in the public schools and will be pressured to change, and your more progressive teacher will be looked down upon in the Catholic school and will be pressured to change in a more traditional style, typically. Of course, there are exceptions. So, even an imperfect application of the above traditional principles of education do result in Catholic schools having more success overall than their public school counterparts in similar neighborhoods. So even students with similar SES status, social economic status, they're going to do better in a Catholic environment because of the above principles, which are the foundation of Catholic education. And of course they will do better than they would in a public environment where, Whilst particular teachers may have more traditional attitudes, educational Marxism or constructivism, moral relativism or rainbowism, and the perpetual lowering of the bar and aiming for the middle third of the students has led to consistently worse performance in academics on a downward spiral for the last 75 years in the United States. So, we are continuing our study of Catholic education. In this video, we're going to dive into the educational philosophy of St. John Baptiste de la Salle and St. John Bosco. This will be an interesting study because while both Catholic educators and saints exercised their Catholic faiths in their classrooms, they did so in very different ways. I think it'd be very interesting to hear these two debate on their theories of education because they do contrast with one another. And if time permits, we'll finish the video by evaluating the educational theories of another Catholic educator, Maria Montessori, who was much more progressive in her views than the two other saints that we'll talk about. We will discuss whether Montessori's educational views are a continuation of the tradition of Catholic education or are in fact a mere Catholic variation of Dewey's constructivism. Let's begin with St. John Baptiste de la Salle. He presents us with an image of a perfectly well-ordered school. We're going to be reading mostly from The Conduct of the Christian Schools, written by St. John Baptiste de la Salle. And let's begin with an introductory letter, a note from that introductory letter for these constitutions, written by Brother Timothy in 1720. This is an encouraging message to anyone working in Catholic schools, or an inspiring message for anyone considering a career in Catholic schools. So Brother Timothy said, "The ardent zeal which you have hitherto manifested in the exercise of the ministry with which God has honored you impels me to exhort you to continue to perfect yourselves in an occupation so holy and useful to the Church as yours. There is nothing greater, my dear brothers, than to dedicate yourselves to giving children a Christian education and inspiring them with the fear and love of God. It is for this purpose that you have consecrated yourselves to God's service, a blessed consecration which will make you great in the kingdom of heaven, according to the promise of our Lord Jesus Christ." All right, now we read from De La Salle's instructions to his teachers. These are the instructions for the well-ordered school in his document titled The Conduct of the Christian Schools. This is the schedule we're going to be reading about if you want to see it all in one place. All right, so the rest of this will be his words, not mine. "The doors of the school will always be opened at 7:30 in the morning and at 1 in the afternoon. There's a midday break. In the morning as well as in the afternoon, the students will always have half an hour in which to assemble. Care will be taken that they do not assemble in a crowd in the street before the door is opened, and that they do not make noise by shouting or singing. They will not be permitted to amuse themselves by playing and running in the vicinity of the school during this time, nor to disturb the neighbors in any manner whatsoever. Care will be taken that they walk with decorum into the street in which the school is situated, and that while waiting for the door to be opened, they stop there in such good order that those who pass will be edified. The head teacher or the inspector of schools will assign one of the more reliable students to observe those who make noise while assembling. This student will merely observe without commenting at the time and will afterward tell the teacher what has happened without the others being aware of it. The kids are not allowed to play and horseplay and all that stuff, just act wild. So the students are encouraged in this school to not act like wild animals. So they're, I've heard people like Matt Walsh criticizing the concept of schools in general because he says it's anti-boy because it doesn't allow boys to be boys and be kind of wild and crazy and all that stuff. And I vehemently disagree with his take on that because boys grow into men who can then become soldiers, who can then play on football teams. Boys can be disciplined. Boys are called to discipline. But they have tons and tons and tons of energy. And masculinity is best expressed when a boy focuses all that energy towards a godly goal. But if you don't help the boy learn to focus that energy towards a godly goal, they don't develop into a disciplined soldier or a disciplined athlete or a disciplined man in general. They develop into like a wild horse. So it's the same thing with a horse. A horse has tremendous strength, which could be used to plow a field, could be used to race, could be used to lead a soldier into battle. But if you don't tame the horse, it's a wild animal that's quite dangerous. It's the same deal with masculinity, and it's the same deal with boys. So this saint, John Baptiste de la Salle, recognized that. He doesn't let the boys mess around. He tells them to be disciplined and to hold themselves up with professionalism and dignity. They also, interestingly, have one student kind of spying on the others, who then informs the teacher who's messing around. So it's kind of a cool practical strategy. All right, how do they enter the building? When the door is opened, care will be taken that the students do not rush forward and enter in a crowd, but that they enter in an orderly fashion, one after the other. Teachers will be attentive to take care that all the students walk so quietly and so calmly while entering the school that their steps will not be heard. So that's pretty cool. Their steps won't be heard. I tell the students to walk quietly all the time because, they'll just not talk in the hallway, but stop walking so loudly. That they remove their hats before taking holy water, that they make the sign of the cross, and that they go at once directly to their classroom. Look at the procedures for how these students enter their classes. They will be inspired to enter the classroom with profound respect, out of consideration for the presence of God, and that is in the learning environment. When they have reached the center of the room, they will make a low bow before the crucifix, and will bow to the teacher if one is present. Then they will kneel to adore God, and to say a short prayer to the Blessed Virgin. After this, they will arise, again bow before the crucifix in the same manner, bow to the teacher, and go quietly and silently to their regular places, their assigned seats. While students are assembling and entering the classroom, they will all maintain such complete silence that not the least noise will be heard, not even of the feet. In this manner, it will not be possible to distinguish those who are entering from those who are studying. So no announcing, I'm here, how are you doing? Just come in the room, talk to God, sit down, begin your studies. Teachers will take care to give warning that those who have talked or made any noise in the classroom during their absence, that is, if the kids enter the room before the teacher, will be punished, and that they will not forgive offenses against silence and good order committed during this time. Of course, they forgive morally, but they're not going to go without punishment. The students will be, frankly, beaten at this time. In the 18th century, they will be beaten if they misbehave, at least, in a mild way, slap in the wrist, whatever. From the time of entering the school, and I'm not advocating beating children, so don't, take me out of context. From the time of entering the school until the arrival of the teachers, those who know how to read will study the catechism, and will do this so quietly that they cannot be heard by the others, and that not the least sound is heard in the classroom. So come in, read the catechism. Teachers will, this is as class begins, teachers will go to their classrooms as soon as the rosary has been said in the morning, and likewise in the afternoon, immediately after the litany of St. Joseph, without stopping anywhere. They will walk with great decorum and in silence, not hastily, but modestly, keeping their eyes and their entire demeanor in great reserve. So look at the way he expects the teacher to uphold themselves, keeping their eyes and their whole demeanor in great reserve. On entering the school, they will take off their hats and take holy water with deep respect. Having reached their own classroom, they will bow before the crucifix, kneel, and make the sign of the cross. After a short prayer and again bowing before the crucifix, they will go to their places. When the teachers enter the school, all the students of each class will rise and remain standing as their teacher enters. Those before whom the teacher passes will bow as the teacher kneels to say the prayer, and will not sit down until the teacher is seated. After the director or anyone else visits the school, students will act in the same manner, but only the first time the visitors enter. So all the kids stand respectfully whenever a new guest or administrator or director enters the classroom. School will always begin punctually at 8 in the morning and at 1:30 in the afternoon. At the last stroke of 8 and the last stroke of 1:30, the student will ring the school bell. At the first sound of the bell, all the students will kneel in a very modest posture and manner with their arms crossed and their eyes lowered. As soon as the school bell has ceased ringing, the prayer leader will begin the prayers in a loud voice, distinctly and calmly. After making the sign of the cross, and after all the students have also made it, the prayer leader will begin the Veni Sancte Spiritus. The other students will recite the prayer with the leader in a lower tone. So the students recite the prayer in a lower tone because children like to be loud, and so he's telling them to pray quietly and lowly, but also it's a sign of humility that you don't need to hear your own voice. So you speak out loud, you pray the prayer out loud, but you don't need your voice to be the one that's heard. So you all try to kind of hide your voice under the voice of the prayer leader. That's the same way that recitations of the dialogue portions of the traditional Latin Mass are said by the assembly at a TLM. They kind of whisper the end of the Our Father, the Sed Libera Nos a Malo. They kind of whisper it to hide their voice under the voice of the priest. Teachers will also take care that students do not throw either nuts or shells on the floor, but will have them put into their pockets or into their bags, so don't leave a mess. Students must be made to understand that it is desirable that they eat in school in order to teach them to eat with propriety, with decorum, and in a polite manner, and to evoke God before and after eating. So they should eat in a holy way at lunch. Teachers will see that the students do not play during breakfast and the afternoon snack, but that they be very attentive to what is being done in school during this time. In order to discover whether they are exact in this, teachers will from time to time make one of the 52 repeat what has been said. One of them, that's just a page number, excuse me. So it makes one of them repeat what has been said, with the exception of those who are occupied in writing. Students will not be permitted either to give anything whatsoever to one another, not even part of their breakfast, or to exchange it. So no trading food. Student leaders. The student who announces the titles of the prayers and the questions of the catechism, because catechism was typically taught in a question and answer memorization format at this time, will correct the other in case a mistake is made in anything. In case the first one does not do this, the teacher will give the signal for a correction. If the student does not know what has been said incorrectly, the teacher, whose duty at the time is to attend both to those who are reciting and to the order of the whole class, will signal another student to make the correction in the same manner as in the lessons. So there's the empowering of some of the students to help take leadership roles in the classroom. What did he say about, again, the teacher's demeanor and the teacher's duties? The teacher should always be seated or should stand in the front of their seats during all lessons, those on the alphabet and syllables as well as those in the books or letters written by hand. They should not leave their places except in cases of grave necessity. They will find that such necessity is very rare if they are attentive. So it's really, really important advice here, even for teachers today, is that if you're standing in the front of the room, carefully watching all of your students, you won't need to go stand next to them to do the whole proximity behavior management thing where you're right next to a kid to get them to stop misbehaving. Because once you have that proximity to one kid, the other kids don't feel like they're being watched anymore, and other kids are more likely to misbehave. The best way to have a well-controlled classroom environment is to stand in the front of the room and to stare at the kids and make them a little bit uncomfortable, make them feel very aware that they are being watched. And when they feel they're being watched, they're less likely to misbehave, they're more likely to do what they're supposed to do. If you stand in the corner of your classroom, you can stare at the corner front of your classroom. You can stare at all your students at the exact same moment. And that's a good classroom management technique. Teachers will be careful to maintain a very modest demeanor and act with great seriousness. Teachers will never allow themselves to descend into anything unbecoming or to act in a childless fashion, such as to laugh or to do anything that might excite the students. The seriousness demanded of teachers does not consist in having a severe or austere aspect, in getting angry, or in saying harsh words, but it's in not lowering yourself to the student's level. That is definitely an opinion of St. John Baptiste that St. John Bosco did not share with him, so it'll be interesting to contrast that point with John Bosco's theory of education. It consists of great reserve. This is how you have seriousness, which he says is demanded of all teachers. It consists of great reserve in your gestures, in your actions, and in your words. Teachers will above all be cautious not to become too familiar with the students, not to speak to them in an easy manner, and not to allow the students to speak to them other than with great respect. In order to acquit themselves well of their duty, teachers must be trained to do the following three things. First, they must watch over all of the students in order to motivate them to do their duty. So watching the students is better than correcting the students. To keep them in order and to maintain silence. Silence is important for students to develop higher level thinking. They have to have silence in order to focus. So having a silent work environment is very important. Second, teachers must keep in hand during all the lessons the book which is actually being read, and must follow the reader exactly, and that's to catch errors in the reading. Third, teachers must pay attention to the one who is reading and to the manner in which the student reads, so that they may give correction when a mistake is made. What are the duties of students in the conduct of Christian schools? The students should always be seated during the lessons, even while reading from the charts of the alphabet and the syllables. They should hold their bodies erect and keep their feet on the floor in good order. Those who are reading the alphabet and the syllables should have their arms crossed. Those who are reading in books should hold their books in both hands, resting them neither upon their knees nor upon the table. They should also look straight before them with their faces turned slightly in the direction of the teacher. The teacher must take care that the students do not turn their heads so much so that they may be able to speak with their companions, and that they do not turn first to one side and then to the other. So, keeping your students from looking at one another even, you can give a kid a consequence for staring at another student. They shouldn't be staring at another student, especially their friends. They should be staring at the board. Even their feet should not be pointed towards a friend. Their feet should be pointed towards the board as well, because where the feet point, the attention follows. While one student is reading, all the others in the same lesson will follow in their books, which they should always have in hand. The teacher will take great care to see that all read quietly what the reader is reading aloud. From time to time, the teacher will make some of them read a few words in passing, surprising them, and finding out if they are following attentively. If they are not following, the teacher will impose upon them some penance or punishment. So punish the kids that, you call them to read and they don't know where you're at. There should be a consequence of some sort to hold them accountable. If the teacher notices that some of them do not like to follow, or more easily or more frequently neglect to do so, the teacher will be careful to make them read last, and even several different times, a little each time, so that the others may also have the time to read. So keep calling them, cold calling them, and make them read last so that they never know when they're going to be called. Because sometimes when you call a kid to read, they might say, oh, well, I'm done reading now, I don't have to follow along. So the kids that don't like following along, make them read last. Just practical advice. So here's some more instruction for mastery learning, and also what mentor text to use. Concerning mastery learning, or that you need to make sure students master one skill before moving on to another, he says, when a student does not know the name of a small letter, the teacher will show the student the capital letter of the same name. If the student doesn't know either of them, some other student who knows it well will be asked to name it. Sometimes the teacher may even call upon a student who's not in the same lesson, so they might have moved on already. The students will never be allowed to call one letter by the name of another more than one instance. For example, to say B for Q, P for D, or other similar mistakes. The student who finds it difficult to remember a letter will be required to repeat it several times in succession, and will not proceed to the next line until this and all the other letters are known perfectly. When all the lines of the alphabet chart have been learned, but before beginning syllables, students will continue to study the entire alphabet until the end of the month. So just because they master it on one day, they don't get to move on right away. They have to keep showing mastery until the end of the month. During all this time, students will be called on to read all the letters at random in order to ascertain whether they are all known. Students will not advance in the lesson until they know all the letters perfectly. He also encourages the use of edifying books for reading instruction, and that's great. In my curriculum, we read The Children of Fatima for one of our reading books. You should be reading edifying books, not merely secular books. He also encourages that if students bring texts from home to read, the teacher needs to keep a close eye on what they're reading. It says no student can bring from home any document to be read in school without the order of the director, and the teacher should be aware and should have read whatever their students are reading, and we should keep an eye on the books our students are reading too, to provide moral instruction to them if the books they're reading have bad moral lessons, which many of them do, especially modern young adult literature. They almost all contain a diversity character who has a dissident sexual orientation of some sort. It's very common in young adult literature today. So if students bring modern young adult books into the classroom, the teacher needs to moderate that and be able to give some instruction. There's also specific instructions about the posture that students need to have. The students need to sit up straight. Their chin, their elbow needs to be placed on the table. He gives permission for them to rest their chin upon their hand, I guess. So their body has to be somewhat turned and free on the same side, and he says that this posture is going to help the student have better handwriting, and that's true. Good handwriting teachers, they'll actually guide students to have good posture that will help them write more neatly. Teachers are encouraged to inspect each child at least once a day. It says you should check the child's work, half of their work in the morning and half of their work in the afternoon, so that every child is checked in with every single day. When the teacher checks in with a child, they will show the students all of the mistakes they have made on whatever they're working on, as well as correct their posture, their manner of holding pens or pencils, their formation of the letters, or their handwriting in general. There's also the practice of continuous prayer. St. Joseph Calasanz had continuous prayer in his schools. We talked about that in the last video. There were always some students in the oratory who were offering prayers to God. And St. John Baptiste de la Salle had that too. There was a rotation of all the students so that at all times some students were praying in the chapel. Like St. Joseph Calasanz, St. John Baptiste appointed certain students to stand in the front of the room and lead prayers. This would be a great way to build leadership in the faith and also foster vocations. Typically, you could choose students that seem like they have expressed that they may have a vocation. These are great students to have to lead in prayer. It goes over the prayers they say here and how they will say them. St. John Baptiste emphasized that the teacher respects the prayer time as much as the students do. And even if you see a child misbehaving during prayer, the teacher is not to reprimand them during prayer, but the teacher is to continue to pray and then after prayer give the students their punishment. All right, so I'm just going to summarize the rest of it here so we can move on to St. John Bosco. De La Salle tells us students must walk quietly in line. They must not go near the walls. If your boys might want to bump into the walls as they walk by them. They're supposed to walk in a straight, disciplined line, sedately and without making any noise, and the teacher can even have them pray the rosary while they're in line. During Mass, there's specific instructions about how to keep the kids focused. But once again, if you see misbehavior, don't reprimand it during Mass, but do so afterwards. Also, he encourages catechism to be taught using the question and answer format to get students to memorize the key doctrines of the faith, providing the material from which they will come to a deeper appreciation of the faith later in life. He says teachers are not supposed to preach during teaching catechism, but ask the students questions and sub-questions continuously until the students have all of these memorized. There's also a set formula for closing prayers for the school day as well. Here are some quotes from St. John Baptiste de la Salle. He says, "God entrusts to you his care of the young. Young people need good teachers like visible angels. And to be entrusted with the teaching of the young is a great gift and grace of God." You can pause and read the rest of these here if you're interested, as well as these. Let's look at some of the quotes of St. Elizabeth Ann Seton and her spirituality. It's necessary for us to have a good spirituality when we work in Catholic education because the work of teaching is a very spiritually taxing career. It's important to have a strong spirituality to do this career without becoming jaded. She says, "The first end I propose in our daily work is to do the will of God. Secondly, to do it in the manner He wills it. And thirdly, to do it because it is His will." She tells us, "If I had to advise parents, I should tell them to take great care about the people with whom their children associate. Much harm may result from bad company, and we are inclined by nature to follow what is worse than what is better." It's a good attitude to have, understanding the effects of original sin. Original sin is very evident in children. They're disposed toward doing the wrong, but also have good hearts, and so they're very formable to try to guide them towards the light, but, all of us are inclined towards doing what is wrong, and children, there's no exception for children. And you all know that if you have a toddler. Toddlers are me, because of original sin, rather than God, God, God. You need to teach them the ways of God. Disorder in the society is the result of disorder in the family. How sweet's the presence of Jesus to the longing, harassed soul. It is instant peace and balm to every wound. The love of talk distracts all the powers of our soul from God, and fills them with earthly objects and impressions, like a vessel of water that cannot be settled, while you are continually stirring the earthly particles from the bottom. Afflictions are the steps to heaven. Be attentive to the voice of grace. Can you expect to go to heaven for nothing? Did not our Savior track the whole way to it with his tears and blood? And yet you stop at every little pain. Here are some more quotes of St. Elizabeth Ann Seton, a great American teacher saint. You can pause and read these if you'd like. Here are some more. Without prayer, I should be of little service. If you'd like to read more about how our school was structured, here is a little bit on that. I'm going to just offer that to you as a resource. You can pause and read here if you're interested, or read the article that I linked there. Next, let's talk about the philosophy of St. John Bosco, which did diverge a bit from St. John Baptiste de la Salle. He developed what's called the preventive system of behavior management, which, as it implies, intends to establish strong relationships with children and motivate them to do what is right, rather than emphasize moral instruction primarily on reactive discipline. And so St. John Baptiste believes that strong immediate punishment system is going to help students develop morally, which there's a lot to that. I mean, students do need consequences and punishments in order to fully realize that wrong is wrong and right is right. But I think that it's appropriate to want to balance St. John Baptiste de La Salle's approach with St. John Bosco's approach. As you can see in the picture here, he loved being one with the children and having a loving relationship with them. He had a different approach towards kind of the aloofness of St. John Baptiste de La Salle. You see both attitudes in Catholic schools of teachers that seem to act a lot more like John Baptiste de La Salle, where they believe the teacher should have a dignified and kind of, I don't want to say distant, but you have enough dignity for yourself. You don't goof around with the kids. You don't play with them at recess. You're holding yourself a bit separate so that there can be more dignity towards the teaching profession, so that there can be more respect and reverence for learning in general. So that approach is a valid approach in the Catholic educational tradition. St. John Bosco, however, has a different approach, and this is another element of the Catholic educational tradition. He, of course, is also a saint, and he did establish strong relationships with the kid by going to their level, doing playing games with them, doing magic shows with them, where he'd do kind of like magic tricks with cards and whatnot, just to kind of get their admiration. And then, once he had these boys' admiration, then he had them wrapped around him like a ring, and these boys would do anything for him, including learn and be successful. So this is an appropriate approach to teaching schools as well. I think both are very good. I think it's good for children to have both styles of teacher in their academic career. The tough teacher, as well as the teacher that goes to their level and really becomes one with them. I think I would argue you kind of need both as a child. You need to deal with both types of authority, and you need to have respect from both. And I think you can learn different things from both styles of teacher as well. So this comes from an address he gave where he articulated his preventive method, and later that address was written down and published. So, part 1. This is his just explaining what his preventive system is, and let's read what he says about it, okay? In what does the Salesian preventive system consist, and why it should be preferred? Through the ages, there have been two systems used in the education of the young, preventive and repressive. The repressive approach consists in making the law known to the students and then supervising them in order to detect transgressions, inflicting, wherever necessary, the merited punishments. Using this system, the words and the appearance of the superior must always be severe and somewhat menacing, and he himself must avoid all friendly relationships with his dependents. Yeah, I think a dean of discipline in general will be more effective at their job if they do take on that role. I think the dean of discipline role in a school should not be a John Bosco-like figure in the school. To give greater weight to his authority, the director would need to be seen, but rarely among his subjects, and generally speaking, only when it was a question of punishing or threatening. This system is easy, less demanding, and is especially useful in the army and among adult and sensible people who ought of themselves to know and remember what is according to the law and other regulations. So he does have a negative view towards the system, respectfully. Of course, I do not have a negative view towards what he calls repressive system. I think it's definitely got its place. And also he says it's only useful amongst people who know what they should do, and children know what they should do. By second grade, they know right from wrong. It's not that complicated in a classroom setting. It's do what your teacher says, and you'll be fine. So if a student's choosing to not do what the teacher told them to do, they know that that's wrong, and you can and should punish them. But he says, quite otherwise, I would say its very opposite is the preventive system. It consists in making known the rules and regulations of an institute, and then supervising in such a way that the students are always under the vigilant eye of the director and the assistants, who, like loving fathers, will converse with them, act as guides in every event, counsel them, and lovingly correct them, which is as much as to say, will put the students into a situation where they cannot do wrong, set them up for success by helping to put them in the right situation. This system is all based on reason, religion, and loving kindness. Because of this, it excludes every violent punishment, but no corporal punishment, but tries to do away even with mild punishments. It seems that this system is preferable for the following reasons. Being forewarned, the pupil is not disheartened when he does something wrong, as happens when such things are reported to the one in charge. Nor does he get angry from being corrected or threatened with punishment, or even from actually being punished, because there has always been through the affair a friendly voice forewarning him, which reasons with him and generally manages to win his friendship, so that the pupil knows there must be a punishment and almost wants it, because the pupil understands why the punishment matters. I think that when giving a punishment, it is very helpful if you don't get emotional giving a punishment, but it's just very matter of fact. Like you broke the rule. Do you understand why we have the rule? Why is this a rule? A good way to get a student to answer why a rule is to ask them, what if everybody did what you just did? What if you don't think everybody could do it in the class function, why do you think you have the privilege to be the only one who's allowed to do the thing you did? Like, if everyone talked during the instruction, how many kids would learn? None. So why can you do it if not everyone can do it? So it's good then to try to administer consequences without any emotion. It's because it's not really you giving the consequence. It's the student, their action gave them the consequence. That's at the heart of what St. John Bosco is saying here. Point 2, the basic reason why young people get into trouble is youthful fickleness, which in a moment can forget the rules of discipline and the punishments they threaten. For this reason, a child often commits a fault and deserves punishment to which he had not given a thought, which he did not remember at all in the act of committing the fault, and which he certainly would have avoided had a friendly voice warned him. The child might have avoided it if somebody warned him. You could post your rules in the class, and that's kind of a warning, and you can even whisper to a kid, hey, don't talk during today's lesson. The kid might still choose to talk. A lot of the times they might choose to talk if they don't think they'll get punished for it. So there is definitely a time and a place for punishment, in my humble opinion, which I do love and respect St. John Bosco. I also love and respect St. John Baptiste de la Salle. He says, the repressive system can stop a disorder, but only with difficulty can it improve offenders. One observes that young people do not forget the punishments they've suffered and generally remain embittered, wanting to throw off the yoke and even to take revenge. It seems at times they pay no heed, but anyone who follows them up in later life knows that the recollections of the young are dreadful, and that they forget the punishments inflicted by their parents, but with great difficulty those given by their teachers. And that's a good point there. He says, oftentimes if you ask a kid about their parents, they'll have loving things to say, but if you ask them about their teachers, they might remember how mean their teachers were. And that's because they know their parents love them, and they might not know that their teachers love them. And so that's a really good point he's making here. Now, in my personal experience, a child will understand the gravity of a fault, of a moral action they did. They'll understand that gravity a lot more clearly if they're punished for it. But if you just sit there and talk to them about why something was wrong, if you don't punish them, your words could say this is so bad. But if you don't punish them, your actions are saying it's not really that bad. So punishments are very important pedagogically. But St. John Bosco raises the important point that your primary impression you want to give a child is that you love them and care for them. And even when punishing them, it's good to re-articulate that you're doing it out of love because you care to see them grow into the man of God they're called to be, or the woman of God they're called to be. St. John Bosco says the practice of this system is based on the words of St. Paul, who says, love is patient, love is kind, it bears all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love is kind and patient, it puts up with all things, and hopes all things, and endures any disturbance. For this reason, only a Christian can successfully apply the preventive system. Reason and religion are the means the educator should constantly make use of, teaching them and making use of them himself, if he wishes to be obeyed and to attain his goal. For this reason, the director should be dedicated to his pupils, nor should he ever assume tasks that would take him away from his duties. On the contrary, he should be among his pupils every time they are taken up with other legitimate tasks. They are not taken up with other legitimate tasks unless they are duly assisted by others. The teachers, the technical instructors, the assistants should all be of known moral rectitude. They should try to avoid, like the plague, every kind of morbid affection or exclusive friendship with pupils, so don't pick favorites. And they should realize that the wrongdoing of just one person can compromise an educational institute. So the teacher has to watch their moral behavior very carefully. They should operate in a way that the students are never alone. As far as possible, the assistants should precede them to the place where they are required to assemble. They should remain with them until others come to assist them. They should never allow them, the students, to be idle. So you should always be with the students because misbehavior happens when they're not being watched. That's a good principle. Teachers should be in the hallway watching behavior out there. They should monitor recess, all that stuff. Point 3. Give them ample liberty to jump, run, and make a din as much as they please. So that's much different than John Baptiste de la Salle, who doesn't allow the kids to play before school. John Bosco says, gymnastics, music, declamation of poems, theatricals, hikes are very effective methods for getting discipline. They favor good living and good health. One must only ensure that the plot, the characters, and the dialogue of these plays, that is, are not unsuitable. That great friend of youth, St. Philip Neri, used to say, do whatever you wish. For me it is enough you do not sin. So he's very lenient compared to John Baptiste de la Salle, who's about students being as disciplined as possible. St. John Bosco has this quote, do whatever you wish as long as it's not a sin. So it's a very different philosophy. Also, he recommends frequent confession, frequent communion, and daily mass as the pillars to support an educational edifice. Let's all pray a Hail Mary that all Catholic schools will start having daily mass. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen. Never require the youngsters to go to the holy sacraments, but just encourage them, and offer them every opportunity to make good use of them. On the occasion of retreats, novenas, homilies, and religious instructions, one should highlight the beauty, the greatness, and the holiness of that religion which proposes, with such easy methods, things as useful to civil society, to peace of heart, to the salvation of one's soul, as are these holy sacraments. In this way, the young people will become involved spontaneously in these religious practices, with pleasure and with fruit. 5. Exercise the strictest vigilance to prevent there being allowed in the Institute friends, books, or persons who carry on bad conversations. And 6. Every evening after the usual prayers and before the students go to bed in a boarding school, he also ran a lot of youth houses, so a lot of the advice he's giving here are not just for schools, but are also for youth ministries. He did a lot of work with young adolescent or kind of tween age youth groups where the students would just kind of assemble for him to do mass and give a speech, and then he'd play games with them. So he did a lot of that work as well as teaching. So it says, avoid like the plague anyone who would want to postpone First Holy Communion to too old an age, when most times the devil has taken possession of the heart of a youngster with incalculable harm to his innocence. According to the discipline of the early church, it was customary to give infants the consecrated hosts left over from the Easter communion. This helps us realize how much the church loves to see children admitted to their first communion in due time. Once a child can tell the difference between bread and shows himself to be sufficiently instructed, pay no attention to his age, and let the heavenly King come to reign in that happy soul. Catechisms recommend frequent communion. St. Philip Neri advised receiving once a week, or even more frequently. And the Council of Trent states clearly that it greatly wishes every faithful Christian to also receive communion each time he goes to Mass. But this communion should not only be spiritual, but in fact sacramental, so that one may gain greater benefit from this august and divine sacrifice. So, here he has some closing thoughts on the preventive system. It should be noted that St. John Bosco, he died, it is said, of exhaustion. So this preventive system is perhaps more exhausting than strict discipline. That's kind of a joke, but I think what he definitely shows us, if you're looking for a reconciliation of St. John Baptiste de la Salle's attitude towards classroom management and St. John Bosco's, I think the reconciliation is this. It can be appropriate to establish loving relationships with your students, and while administering consequences to them, foster as much of an awareness amongst your students as possible that you love them and actually love them. And love for your students begins with daily prayer for them, offering spiritual sacrifices for them. It also involves listening to them, establishing commonalities with them, appreciating what you have in common with your students. And St. John Bosco was also an entertainer. He got the students' attention and he got the students' admiration by doing things that entertained them. And one good way to avoid having a mutiny in your classroom or having a class clown raise up is for you to be the most entertaining person in the room. And if that's your personality, you can perform a little bit. Teaching is performative. Teaching is theatrical. St. John Bosco was a master performer for his children that he taught, and then he did these youth groups with. He did magic tricks. He did like tightrope tricks. He did all kinds of things to get their attention. But you have to do what's authentic and what's natural for you, and that could be just being very scholarly and being interesting in that way. But I think being the most entertaining person in the room will prevent a class clown from getting any of the children's attention, because you're the person they want to pay attention to. You're the one entertaining them. But once again, I think we do have to balance both of these attitudes. I think a school is well served by a teacher that leans more towards John Bosco and teachers that lean more towards St. John Baptiste de la Salle, but I think a reconciliation between both of their attitudes is appropriate, and we're grateful that God has given us both of these educators to help enlighten the way that we work with youth and teach them. He says, the student will have the greatest respect for the educator and will go on recalling with pleasure the orientation he was given, always considering his teachers and the other superiors as fathers and brothers. So if they recognize that the teacher is a fatherly role in their life, or a motherly role for female teachers, I'm sure that would apply as well. So you can pause and read his closing thoughts here. He does urge that punishments be given in private, apart from companions, so as not to embarrass the child. He says that you should never pull children's ears, or slap them, or make them kneel in painful positions. So he's against corporal punishment, basically, which is pretty ahead of his time in the 19th century, early 19th century, mid-19th century. He once again articulates that rules must be well known, and punishments not be given for things that students didn't really have a chance to understand was a rule. So I did say, if we had time, we'd talk about Maria Montessori. I think we'll briefly overview her views here. Was she a great Catholic educator? I'll try to keep this video at about an hour, 20 minutes. So she was a self-professed devout Catholic who regularly attended Mass. She lived and died in the grace of the Church, attending Mass, attending to the sacraments, and she hoped to submit her philosophy to her faith, or at least not step outside the boundaries of her faith. However, her approach was built primarily upon the epistemological premises of naturalistic empiricism. She always sought to deduce principles from observable phenomenon rather than allow tradition itself to guide her philosophy. We can note that St. Thomas Aquinas also primarily based his work off of deductive reasoning or deductive Aristotelianism in a manner that was faithful to tradition. St. Augustine and his tradition is more inspired by Platonism, which is more principle-inspired. There are self-evident principles that everything's built upon. St. Thomas Aquinas does base his philosophy off of deductive reasoning. Maria Montessori's approach to education emphasized the spiritual development of the child, recognizing that the child does have a spiritual nature. She viewed education to be integral to the overall growth of the individual child. Her Catholic beliefs inspired her educational philosophy. She viewed education as a way to help children reach their full potential, which regarded their intellectual and spiritual life. Her feminism, however, and her ideas, which were inspired by feminism, and her political theories, regarded a lot of traditional educational methods as being oppressive to children. And this certainly wasn't the traditional attitude of figures like Saint John Baptiste de la Salle or Saint Joseph Calasanz. However, her intention of remaining within the grace of the Church while trailblazing her own theory of learning and education does make her thought worthy of consideration. So here are some excerpts from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy on the thought of Maria Montessori. She did include her thoughts about God and the relationship between God and the child in her educational theories. She emphasized the child's own powers given to him by the Creator as being the principal means by which the child learns. She recognized the wonderful powers of divine creation in the child's soul, and said that children in spiritual freedom disclose the will of God. So she's saying that if a child is in a state of spiritual freedom, they are inclined towards pursuing God's will, and learning is a part of that. some would criticize her for not emphasizing enough the role of original sin. However, she would be more inclined to respond that, in her opinion, the effects of original sin in a child were not as bad as in an adult, because the adult had compounded their original sin with their personal sin, further deforming their soul, but a child was more pure or innocent. That was her perspective. Tell me your thoughts about that below. I do think that there's an element to children being more innocent. They do not have certain desires, which are kind of learned, so there's an element of truth to that. At the same time, I think that toddlers show you kind of the baseline human state of being totally self-centered. That's the way we pop out, is being very self-centered. And it's through learning, by being taught that that's not an appropriate way to behave, and hopefully being taught through moral instruction by your parents, that people begin to not act like toddlers anymore. Without moral formation, however, there are adults who still behave like toddlers, because that is the natural disposition of original sin. It's my response to that. Her pragmatist epistemology was hierarchical, in that perceptual knowledge or lower order concepts were the building blocks of higher order concepts. So she bases everything off of empiricists' deductive reasoning. Her epistemology is hierarchical or empiricist in that she identified the five senses as the foundation of every entire intellectual organism. She said there can be neither ideas nor imagination nor any intellectual construction if we do not presuppose an activity of the senses. However, she believed that your ideas or your attitudes that you have internally will affect what sensory stimuli you choose to process, because we choose to ignore things that don't correlate with our internal ideas. So she did believe that your ideas are based on your senses, but then she believed, well, the ideas you reinforce throughout your life will then affect which sensory stimuli you choose to emphasize in your processing of reality. So she believed there was a back and forth between your internal ideas and your sensory experience. She highly emphasized the development of cognitive virtues. So she had a lot of virtue ethics were very important to her, and so that's an important part of Montessori education, is developing virtues. Let's read right here, and you can of course pause and read the rest of these experts if you want, or read the entire article. In particular, Montessori came to see that children have a sort of agency that strives to do challenging work independently, and that, when placed in the conditions conducive to flourishing, gives rise to several crucial Montessori virtues, including what she calls character, respect for the work of others and consideration for the rights of others, and a deep sort of unity that she called social solidarity. Moreover, by focusing on the development of the moral life in children, and particularly young children, Montessori drew attention to the essentially embodied and enacted nature of moral agency and ethical life. So the basis of Montessori education is placing children in an environment conducive to flourishing, where you can remove the impediments to spiritual and intellectual flourishing and help the child be set loose to go discover new knowledge on their own. Montessori education is typically self-guided. The student explores the areas that they are most interested in learning about, and your job as a teacher is to facilitate that learning environment. At the beginning of the study, we talked about John Dewey's constructivism, that he believed the teacher's role was a facilitator of knowledge. That is very similar to Montessori's attitude towards education. It does de-emphasize the role of the teacher as the transmitter of knowledge through lectures, and it emphasizes that the teacher is a facilitator of the student's own self-discovery. This talks more about Montessori's views on original sin, if you want to read more about that, according to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. She believed that normalized child behavior would be virtuous. If you were to put them in a normal environment without spiritual or intellectual impediments, they would pursue learning and virtue automatically on their own. She said that whereas children subject to discipline, oppression, or deprivation have to repress natural expressions of their agency, children in conditions of freedom can be fully human and thereby flourish as human beings. This process provides Montessori with a naturalistic means for identifying conditions of human excellence. So she believed that children in an environment where there was a lot of discipline and punishment, like St. John Baptiste de la Salle schools, would not be able to flourish, whereas St. John Baptiste de la Salle would say that by requiring students to be highly disciplined, they are able to focus their energy towards the highest goods. She argued that when students are not able to listen to their base desires or their natural desires, they will be repressed and they will not develop fully into the person they're supposed to be. The idea that you need to simply let the student's own desires guide the student's actions, that is the sort of thinking that modern psychology is based upon. And there's not much of a filter here to prevent children from pursuing sinful behaviors or disordered behaviors if we allow their own desires to be the pilot of their moral life. She highly believes in sort of an original goodness. She believes that original sin exists. Yeah, she's not willing to deny it, but she doesn't really seem to feel that you have to account for concupiscence when you're guiding children. She's highly concerned that children are raised in tyrannical environments where the authorities in their lives, the parents, are oppressing them and not allowing them to develop or unfold in the way they want to all on their own. She believes that if you want a student or a child to have a flourishing life, you need to simply allow them to do what they feel inclined towards doing. Maybe I'm misrepresenting her. If you feel that I am, please leave your comment below. But in general, her attitude is not really consistent with the Catholic intellectual tradition, with the Catholic educational tradition for that reason. Additionally, Montessori believed in scientific feminism. She highly promoted scientific literacy as a means for elevating women's status in society. She was the first female physician in Italy. She was what's considered an early Italian practical feminist. And while she didn't fall into the same grievous errors of later feminists, which were pro-abortion, pro-contraception, pro-choice, all that stuff, pro-sexual liberation, all that stuff, she didn't fall into those errors. She'd never died outside of the graces of the church, but she was a part of the movement that would, through the natural extension of its initial premises, would reach those conclusions. She reportedly said, "My wish is for women to fall in love with scientific reasoning," which is good. Women should. Scientific reasoning is logic based. Highly emphasizes empiricists, validating of your beliefs with empirical data, which is a good tool to have in your intellectual toolkit. It's not the only tool, and when it is the only tool, we fall into errors of materialism and atheism. Balbina, in her 2023 article, argues that Maria Montessori sought to identify rationality itself as a guide to female conduct, even in the most personal and intimate choices, including marriage, and even the choice of motherhood, which should be referred back to a female consciousness illuminated by science. She's trying to imply that Montessori was on the way to being pro-choice. Though that would not be accurate, in my opinion. If she wanted to be within the grace of the church, I think she would have rejected abortion if that had become a hot topic issue during her intellectual life, but that's what this scientist is trying to argue here. We read here that her feminism affected her broader philosophy. Fundamental to her philosophical methodology was profound awareness of the often invisible oppressions of children, as adults paternalistically care for them in ways that ultimately undermine their dignity and development, or so she believed. Strong parents, firm parents, strict parents raise good children that are successful. Lenient parents often raise children with mental illness and often raise children that are not thriving in school. They're unhappy. They don't have boundaries externally or internally in their intellectual life or their spiritual life, their inner life. And of course, a lot of people are afraid about maybe being too strict. But I've taught for about a decade now, and with all the families that I've seen and gotten to know the parents and their parenting styles, and seeing those kids grow older, erring on the side of being too strict is going to be better than erring on the side of too lenient. Because when you're too strict, you're having higher standards for your children. When you're too lenient, you typically have lower standards for your children. You expect more of them when you're too strict, you expect less of them when you're too lenient. So if you have to pick a side to err, which you should try not to, but if you have to pick a side to err, it's better to err on being too strict. But that's not the view of Maria Montessori. She's afraid of tyrannical parenting. She talks about how we are concerned with dictatorial politicians, but we're not afraid of being a dictator of our children. So It's definitely her view of parenting, which is why Montessori is popular today, not really amongst traditional Catholics. She's popular today amongst mainly liberals. And when liberals write about her, they're typically not going to mention her Catholic faith because they don't need to. Because even though she was Catholic, for the most part, you could fully run a Montessori school being completely secular because her principles are primarily secular. It's at least my opinion. What do you think? Do you think Maria Montessori's theories of learning continue the tradition of Catholic education as explored in these videos? Or are her ideas simply a synchronization of Dewey's constructivism with some elements of Catholic anthropology, doing damage primarily to Catholic anthropology rather than the theories of John Dewey, who I know was a figure after she was very popular, so I'm not saying that she was inspired by Dewey, but she kind of participates in that movement rather than provides a Catholic take on it. Alright, so in these videos, we examined the theory of learning of St. Thomas Aquinas, the style of school established by St. Joseph Calasanz and St. John Baptiste de la Salle. We looked at the spirituality of St. Elizabeth Ann Seton, the preventive method of St. John Bosco, and the thought of Maria Montessori. Let's pray that any viewers who may feel the call of God to leave your nets behind and follow Jesus into a career in Catholic education will do so with great haste. In nomine Patris, et Filii, et Spiritus Sancti. Ave Maria, gratia plena, Dominus tecum. Benedicta tu in mulieribus, et benedictus fructus ventris tui, Iesus. Sancta Maria, Mater Dei, ora pro nobis peccatoribus, nunc et in hora mortis nostrae. Amen. In nomine Patris, et Filii, et Spiritus Sancti. Thank you so much for watching this video all the way to its conclusion. I pray that the Holy Spirit removes from your mind anything I've said unfaithful to him or untrue. See you next time. Bye.